So our first question tonight is, what is capitalism? Anybody? Yes? Yes, you can plug in your computer. But only if you tell me what capitalism is. What is capitalism?
The United States.
Well, certainly the United States has capitalism. But what is it? When we say the United States is a capitalist country, what do we mean? Yeah?
We acquire resources and trade them.
Yes, but we would do that in socialist countries as well. So the question is what the distinction is, because any economy is going to involve the acquisition and the allocation of resources, right?
Like people own their own like private industry.
Yes, right. So the distinction is that the ownership is private, and the sort of the most broadly accepted definition is that it's private ownership of the means of production. So the means of production is those things that can either generate wealth or that, in certain cases constitute wealth in and of themselves. And by and large, we use the term means of production interchangeably with the word capital. So capital, wealth, are things that can be used to create wealth. So as I mentioned to you in discussing economic power, the good news about capitalism is that it works. It genuinely, when it is practiced in its freest form, will allocate resources in the most effective manner. It will really truly do this. The bad news is it does not care about you. So as I mentioned also then, it is the case that if you have a situation where the price of some good or service falls, and you are a producer of that good, the sales of that good for which you need to survive, then in order for you to survive, if the market sets the price of that lower, it's going to require you cutting cost in some way. And that could be in paying your workers less, in firing some of your workers, in cutting production costs, including possibly in the safety inherently of the product itself, or of the safety that your workers enjoy. So all of these things can have negative consequences, obviously. But we say that a market is really only free in the fullest sense of the word when there's no restraint on the ability of supply and demand to operate without any limitations. And that means unions are a big restraint on markets to operate freely. Taxes are a big restraint as well. Last thing about capitalism to point out is that no society in the world operates on the basis of pure capitalism. So we have a system that is much more capitalist than most other countries in the world. But we still don't have a purely capitalist system. We have a post office, for instance, where the government plays the role of being responsible for the delivery of mail for all citizens, regardless of any qualifying factor. And yeah, there are competing services, but they cost more. We also have a public school system, as opposed to a strictly private school system where markets can set costs, and that's obviously offset by taxation. We also have things like, garbage collection, and in certain places, utilities are owned owned or operated by government. And when we say when the public or the government, usually being synonymous with the public in that particular regard, when the public owns the means of production, we call that socialism. And so all countries operate on some combination of the two. It's just a question of which is predominant. And in most of the developed world, capitalism is predominant. It's a question of how much socialism these economies have incorporated into them. Here it's pretty low. In Scandinavia, for instance, in Western Europe, it's relatively high. So, questions so far? So this is Adam Smith. He was Scottish and was a university professor, taught at the University of Edinburgh. And he published in 1776, same year as our revolution, he published a book called The Wealth of Nations, a huge number 2 of pages of which you have in your textbook. He also co-founded the Royal Society of Scotland. He was sort of the embodiment, it is said, of the Scottish Enlightenment. Remember, the Enlightenment is this period that follows, in most of Europe, follows the end of the 30 Years' War. In the UK, follows slightly later than that because of the ongoing religious dispute, but this is the point at which religion and government in Northern and Western Europe become mostly separate. And at which point, therefore, it is now possible for inquiry into multiple different, in particular scientific areas, becomes much more possible. But it also has the effect of generating a significant amount of cultural output as well, including essentially what's called classical economics, which Smith is a big proponent of. So the Wealth of Nations is an extended argument in favor of what is called laissez-faire capitalism, which is basically an argument for highly unrestricted capitalism, for minimal, if not, and it isn't, by the way, it isn't no government involvement in regulating the economy, but it is minimal government involvement in the regulation of the economy. And so, because he believes that the ability of markets to allocate resources most efficiently is a thing to be preserved to the greatest extent possible. So it's important to put this within the context of what we were talking about in the last class about Locke and about the idea of liberalism and the idea of liberalism being based on the idea of small government. So, importantly, you might hear the word liberal used in the United States to refer to people who are on the political left. We are, in the United States, unique in using it for that meaning. Other countries don't use it to mean that. When other countries that speak English refer to liberalism, they are referring to the advocacy for small government, which is precisely the opposite sense in which it's used by conservatives for people that would probably more rightly be called progressive. So this is sort of the big, a big misunderstanding that comes along with the term, but for most of history and for most of the world, liberalism is small government. And in the case of Locke, is a proponent of liberal democracy, but liberalism can exist without democracy. It's just the idea that government is limited and small, and so not only small, but limited too. Right? And so, remember, Locke says that it's the role of government to protect life, liberty, and property. And when it talks about protecting property, what that means, other than making sure that nobody steals from you, is that the government is there to settle disputes over property peacefully, but that's the extent of government's involvement. So Smith is in this tradition as well. Smith is definitely influenced by Locke, as most English-speaking philosophers of liberalism are. And so he sort of makes quite plain this fundamental link between liberalism and everything that it is associated with and capitalism. With the understanding, furthermore, that when government is small and limited, freedom is maximized, and that this freedom should go beyond just the extent to which the government makes laws. Right? So Locke says that government should only make laws for the good of the people. It should never make laws that are in disagreement with common law or precedent. and it should not get involved in making laws where the government doesn't have any role to play. If the law doesn't have to do with the protection of life, liberty, or property, then the government shouldn't be making that law. So the argument goes, that kind of government, which is small and limited, gives rise to the greatest amount of freedom on the part of the people that live under that government. And that freedom from government should extend to economic affairs. So that government should only become involved in economic affairs where there's a dispute over property. Now, Smith believes this in part because he believes in something that he calls the invisible hand, by which he says free market capitalism ultimately benefits all people in a society. Although he says that this is a side effect of capitalism rather than the intrinsic purpose of capitalism. The purpose of capitalism is to make money, to generate wealth. A positive side effect, Smith says, is that it improves the society at large. To be deliberate about this, he says, actually undermines the process. What's invisible about the hand is that nobody's doing this purposefully. But he also stipulates that it relies on money staying within the economy in order to work. And then he says, finally, there are three roles for government: protecting the society from invasion, protecting citizens from the depredations and aggressions of one another. And then he says, the duty of erecting and maintaining certain public works and certain public institutions. And we'll talk about that when we look at the text itself. But it's important to point out about that it means that he actually does see a role for government beyond protecting life, liberty, and property. The duty of erecting and maintaining certain public works and certain public institutions is the duty of government, he says, because if it isn't profitable, nobody's going to want to do it, right? If it's something that's going to have to be, a business that's going to have to be carried out at a loss, then nobody's going to accept it and do it of their own free volition, and therefore it's government's responsibility to pick up that as well. So there's a few things that arise in discussing Smith's ideas and the last 250 years of their being applied. And so Smith believes that it is an unintentional but nevertheless positive side effect of capitalism that it improves, it benefits all people in a society. So question number one is that true? And I'm not suggesting that there's a right or wrong answer to that question, or that any of you in particular might actually know it. But here's the thing. So there are certain observable consequences of capitalism. Number one is that it actually does lift the bottom significantly. So, and we know this basically for a lot of reasons, but a sort of a core piece of evidence that we have for this is that, after 1991, when the Soviet Union was dissolved, all the countries that had been supported by the Soviet Union, particularly countries in the developing world, and very particularly in Africa, were countries that had stagnated in their economic growth. And when Western banks and the International Monetary Fund and other organizations like that, which are very deeply dedicated both to development as well as to capitalism, came in and invested in those countries, and did so in a way that was that favored private industry and entrepreneurship and capitalism, the lowest rates of poverty in those countries were raised. Which means that to take the most extreme examples of poverty in the world in the 1990s, they improved enormously. That's not disputable, and it's really sort of not disputable that, that the infusion of money with the purpose of people making profit at the end of it was a big part of that process. So to say that capitalism raises the lowest standards of living to something bigger is a true statement. And we also have sort of other ways of observing this. And in particular, and we'll talk about this in a lot more detail when we look at Marx in the week after next. But Smith is writing before industrialization really gets underway, and Marx is writing 70 years later. And when Marx is writing, there has actually taken place a significant amount of industrialization. Now they're in different countries. Smith is in Scotland, and then he's subsequently also in London. And London industrializes rather rapidly. Germany, actually, where Marx is from, industrializes incredibly rapidly. And so Marx is able to observe some of the consequences of what capitalism, when it is combined with a high rate of industrialization, what it does, basically. And it, again, does this thing whereby it raises the lowest levels of poverty. So absolute poverty figures in the UK, and certainly in Germany as well, with increased industrialization, they go up. And the real kind of appreciable results of this are that when there's a profit incentive that's put into things like medical development and research, then diseases get cured and infant mortality becomes far less of a problem. And so life expectancy goes up enormously over the course of the 19th century as industrialization and more deeply rooted capitalism take hold in Western Europe. And again, that's not an accident. That's an appreciable result of what capitalism does in these societies. Raises the bottom and raises the standard of living, generally speaking. And the last thing about this is that because capitalism is a mode of production where goods and services are being produced, it increases standard of living because it produces more goods for people to buy and a greater variety of goods and services for people to have. And that doesn't necessarily do anything to the problem of poverty, but it definitely does something for the overall quality of life in terms of the ability of people to have something new and different in their lives. So all of these are things that, viewing the 250 years since Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations, we can observe as being parts of what capitalism actually has done, and that it has done even more so when combined with industrialization, which again was a process that really hadn't gotten underway when Smith had published The Wealth of Nations. So I think it's possible to grant to Smith that there are definite positive consequences for capitalism. Now, that said, something else that capitalism does, and it again does this demonstrably and appreciably, is that because it is a system of wealth creation, economies get bigger and they become wealthier. But that wealth doesn't get distributed on anything like an equal basis. Instead, what happens within capitalist economies is that that wealth gets concentrated very much at the top. So what happens in a capitalist economy, particularly when it is a relatively unregulated capitalist economy, is that the economy becomes wealthier, development continues apace, the bottom is raised, but a small but important class of extremely wealthy people emerge. And so you don't have people like, in the United States, the Rockefellers, or the Carnegies, or the Vanderbilt family, until there's industrialization and until there is this process of incentivizing private industry to undertake these humongous works that will generate tremendous amounts of wealth. And when they do, yeah, they absolutely improve the quality of life for people, right? I mean, the Vanderbilts build the railroads. Rockefellers, they're in oil exploration, so they make possible, because one of the things that's not often said about the Industrial Revolution is that it begins with a steam engine, right? But you still need to heat water to get steam. So you're still going to need some kind of fuel to heat water, and petroleum is going to very much play that role. And then it's going to be discovered that it can be used as a fuel in its own right to fuel, cars and stuff like that. And so, petroleum will be discovered, and the car industry will be built by and large out of that rather than the other way around. And Rockefeller, of course, will become the wealthiest person in history. The Carnegies are involved in steel, and so steel was needed not just for the railroads, but for any number of different forms of industrial production. And these men all became billionaires, which is not a thing that had existed before then, really. So what we say about this is that while it's true that there is an increase in the bottom, right? So just in terms of the condition of the people who are at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, their condition is improved. Development increases enormously, so quality of life goes up, but wealth is concentrated at the top. So what happens is that there's wealth inequality that becomes greater than it's ever been in the past. The division between the rich and the poor will be bigger than it's ever been. And not only will it be bigger than it's ever been, but there will be fewer people at the absolute top than ever before, with more than ever before. So that there's actually less in terms of the wealth that exists within a society at any point in time for the people that are at the bottom to share among themselves. And if you take into account that one of the consequences of capitalism is that greater development means lower mortality, longer life expectancies, lower infant mortality, therefore bigger populations, that actually causes there to be more poor people. More poor people who are less poor than their grandparents or great-grandparents were, but nevertheless poor. So that's something that capitalism does, unavoidably. Now, this is not to say that therefore capitalism should, we should kick it out the door and we should do things differently, because it is also demonstrably the case that that economies that don't adhere to it or adhere to it very little are just not nearly as healthy, and just don't provide the improvement in quality of life, the amount of wealth that's available to the society as a whole, and all of these other things that are necessary and good and that we're used to, frankly. The question then becomes, okay, well, what do we do to remediate the problem of a growing base of people that are poor, where there's a very small number of people who are not only extremely rich, but continue to get even more wealthy? So that the wealth that's created in a capitalist economy continues to be created, right? Economies grow. One of the core ideas behind a capitalist economy is that there isn't, and unless you stop the clock at one point in time, you can say, okay, right now our economy is worth X amount of money. But tomorrow it's going to be worth more, and it's going to be worth more the day after that. They grow. I mean, unless there's recession, which is literally what negative growth is. But otherwise, the economy grows. Wealth grows. So how do you remediate this problem whereby a smaller number of people have more and more wealth, greater inequality exists with a growing number of people that are poor? Well, first of all, the question to ask yourself is, why is that a problem? Why is that a problem? We've always had poor people. So why is it a problem? I mean, very few people in the world, even historically speaking, even, and we'll talk about communism as an outgrowth of socialism, even the communists, by and large, accepted the idea that you weren't going to have everybody be equal. There was going to be people, you know, at different rates of income and wealth and things like that. There was always going to be some kind of hierarchy that would emerge. They recognized that. But what is, so if hierarchies are to some extent natural, right? People will, in any kind of competition, people will come out on top and people will come out on the bottom and everybody else is going to come out in the middle. Why is poverty an issue then? Yeah?
If the balance is so unequal, then eventually society might collapse.
Well, yeah, right? I mean, and this is something that we talked about when we talked about Plato and the whole idea of government by the wealthy, plutocracy. Now, it's, yeah, I mean, on one level, it is definitely true that Plato's argument pertains specifically to political power rather than economic power. But it's also true at the same time that those things are very closely related, particularly in a capitalist society. And particularly in a capitalist society where there are few or no limits on the extent to which wealth can be directly translated into political power, right? So, yeah, I mean, Plato recognized 2,500 years ago that at some point, the mass of people who don't have what they feel either they need, might genuinely need for that matter, or that they're entitled to, that's going to reach a tipping point where it's going to no longer be sustainable. And it's unsustainable for another point as well, which is that, and again, we'll talk about this much more when we talk about Marx, but the extent to which development and industrialization tends to then urbanize societies. Right? So I've mentioned a number of times that, you know, until 300 years ago, 90% of people were involved in farming, and that included Western societies that are today the most developed economies in the world. But that changed drastically after the Industrial Revolution. And those people that were no longer involved in farming went to cities and they took up trades. What Marx points out is that there was a tendency of capitalism, particularly once industrialized, to push people out of trades and into, to simplify it for the time being, factory labor. So now what happens is the class of wealthy people are people that are involved in industrial production. They're a small number, they're extraordinarily wealthy, and increasingly so, particularly in an urban environment, everybody else works in the factories of those wealthy people. And Marx will argue, Smith does not, but Marx will argue that, that what is unfair about that situation is that the actual products and goods that are being made by the laborers, the value of those products is inherent in the work that's being done by the people, not by the people that are managing the factory or owning the factory for that matter. And so in that sense, there's Marx's basic idea is that the value of the products is stolen from the workers. But even in a case like Smith, there's a recognition, even among most laissez-faire economists or advocates of free markets, that you just can't let people get so poor that they can't take care of themselves. If for no other reason than because, for the reasons that we've already pointed out, they'll get angry. You know, and when a large enough group of people are angry enough, they can make the consequences for the very wealthy very bad, as history has shown us several times. So rather than, so what do we do here to remediate the issue of poverty? How does our system, which is a predominantly capitalist system, address the issue of poverty? Yeah.
How much you're taxed?
So how much you're taxed is a big part of it. Right, so we operate on what's called a progressive taxation system, which just means the more money you make, the higher rate at which you are taxed. And in theory, the idea, and this is called redistribution, the idea is that through taxation, and particularly through taxing people heaviest at the uppermost levels, that revenue can then be redistributed to people at the bottom through either direct aid or other kinds of programs that incentivize the extension of welfare or jobs to people that are at the bottom. That their condition is made better in some way. Now, we have two obvious sort of periods during American history when this was undertaken by the United States government to a very large extent. The first time is in the New Deal under Roosevelt. And at that point, there was like a third of the country was living in poverty, so it was pretty much unavoidable that government was going to have to do something. And yeah, there was a huge rise in taxation. And the second time was in the 1960s under President Johnson, with this realization that, first of all, minority communities were still overwhelmingly poor, number one. Number two, half of all retired people were living in poverty at that point as well. And so there's this huge program that's brought out by President Johnson called the War on Poverty, and it actually literally cuts poverty in half pretty much overnight. So redistribution, it has a tendency to work. The issue with why high taxation and redistribution are problematic goes back to Smith, right? Because Smith says, well, if you do that, if you tax heavily, in fact, some would argue if you tax at all, other than what's absolutely minimally necessary, then you are you're restraining the ability of the market to allocate resources on its most efficient basis. And you can just put it again in a very concrete way of understanding it by example. If you're the factory owner and you all of a sudden get hit with heavier taxes, that means your profits are going to go down. And because some amount of those profits that you're getting, you need to put back in your business, B, pay your own bills, so on and so forth, you're going to need to offset that loss in taxation in some way. So again, you can pay workers less, you can fire workers, you can cut cost of production, you can do any number of other things. But taxes are going to negatively affect a person that's whose job it is to be a producer of goods and services. It's just the way that it is. So all of these are things that we should table for now, but bear in mind going forward, because going back to the sort of the beginning of the argument, if it's true that capitalism is both very essentially related to the idea of freedom, right? If you've got a free society with a limited government, then capitalism is necessarily going to be an outgrowth of that, because you're going to have government doing only the bare minimum that's necessary, and so it's not going to regulate the economy to any great extent. Then capitalism is going to be the way that people do things. And we know this, by the way, just because it's basic psychology. Number one, people like to have stuff, and once they have stuff, they want more stuff. And B, people respond to incentives. When they're incentivized with a reward of some kind to be productive, they are more productive. So those aren't really disputable things either. So in an environment where there is no regulation, capitalism is going to be what is created. Conversely, then, the argument goes as well that capitalism generates greater freedom in and of itself, because it provides greater freedom of choice, for instance, by a greater array of products, that by sort of undergirding support for liberalism in the form of small government, it maintains freedom of people, generally speaking, to do what they want, to say what they want, for that matter. The counter-argument to that is that poverty makes those things less true. That if you take two people and put them in an environment where every other thing being the same, which is to say their relationship with the government and the government's ability to give them freedom or conversely to oppress them, is equal. It is indisputable again, that the wealthy person is going to have an easier time of it than the poor person is going to have. And that therefore, if freedom is to some extent correlated with capitalism and with wealth, less wealth means less freedom. Again, a point for further down the road. So, page 627 in your book. Every individual is continually exerting himself to find out the most advantageous employment for whatever capital he can command. Remember, capital being wealth or things that create wealth. It is his own advantage indeed, and not that of the society which he has in view, but the study of his own advantage naturally, or rather necessarily, leads him to prefer that employment which is most advantageous to the society. So that first paragraph just basically is Smith's point of view about this invisible hand thing. That profit motive has the unintentional but nevertheless positive consequence that it does good for society. Second paragraph. As every individual therefore endeavors as much as he can both to employ his capital in the support of domestic industry and so to direct that industry that its produce may be of the greatest value, every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. So, two things to point out there. First, again, appealing to the idea that people are motivated by profit, he sees this as a positive thing because it positively benefits society. But notice in the second line in that paragraph, he says, in the support of domestic industry. So, if a person is operating a business, selling a good or service within a society, then, according to Smith's calculation, his own individual profit is equivalent to the society's profit. Society benefits by virtue of this unintentional consequence, but only if that business is done within that society. So that, by the way, raises problems in and of itself. For one thing, it doesn't take into account another important aspect of this, which is globalization. Anybody know what globalization is? Yes.
When poor countries can benefit from richer countries going
I'm sorry, say again.
I think it's when poor countries can benefit from richer countries doing business in those poor countries.
Right. So globalization is very sort of closely linked to the idea of free trade. And free trade essentially is the idea that national borders should have less and less to do with the way business is conducted. And so sort of the most important free trade agreement that the United States has, at least as I'm speaking, although apparently it's being renegotiated to some extent, is the North American Free Trade Agreement, whereby the United States no longer penalizes businesses in the United States for doing business in Mexico and Canada, and vice versa, by the way. Canadian companies can now do business here without being penalized, and Mexican companies can do business here as well. By the way, just as a point of interest, so where do you think the majority of the jobs are going in that deal under NAFTA? Anybody know? 3 countries: United States, Canada, and Mexico. 2 countries that are developed nations and one that is a developing nation, Mexico. Although Mexico is at the upper end of developing nations, it is nevertheless still a developing nation, has a very high degree of poverty, particularly in rural areas and particularly among indigenous people. Yeah.
So when they go to Mexico?
It goes to Mexico, right. And it goes to Mexico mainly because the cost of labor there is less. Right? I mean, if the economy is less developed, it means their cost of living is lower, which means necessarily, because they still operate as well on some form of capitalism, the negotiation that goes between management and workers results in a lower rate of pay. If you're a company CEO of a board in Canada or in the United States, and you can move those jobs to Mexico and pay somebody less, you'll do that. Because again, I mean, in talking about economic power and corporations, their goal is to maximize profit. And one surefire way of maximizing profit is to pay people less. That doesn't mean, by the way, that the standard of living for the people in Mexico is made worse. It's actually significantly made better because these companies are able to pay the workers in Mexico more than they might be able to make otherwise. The downside of that, of course, is that workers in Canada and the United States lose their jobs. So that's a positive and a negative consequence of globalization. The argument on a broader sense is that, again, because it's a form of capitalism, it lifts the absolute bottom, the poorest people in the world become less poor. And that's definitely true. But that doesn't offset the negative consequences for people within another country. So, we've got an election coming up, and so you're going to hear people saying bad things about NAFTA for precisely that reason. If you lost your job at a car factory or a steel mill or whatever, whether it's true or not, it can be turned by a politician into an attack against free trade. Which is not to say free trade is good or bad, it's just free trade has both positive and negative consequences. What's important about that is that Smith was writing before there was globalization. So he views economics as stopping at the border of your country, which, back then was true. It had the benefit of being true on top of everything else. I mean, remember that in 1776, as I mentioned in the last class, the UK and France had just gotten over a war. And so it wasn't like they were going to have free trade with France. That wasn't going to happen. So, and they also, and this is the other part about globalization that didn't apply then, but applies now, is that, well, I mean, the UK did have a globalized market of sorts, it's just that it was a colonial market. And so they weren't concerned about, labor costs in North America, for instance, because it was a slave economy. And so their labor costs were nil. What they had to worry about was the costs of shipping goods back and forth between North America and Europe. So yeah, I mean, he doesn't take that into account because the economies in the colonies operate somewhat separately, although they do provide this huge infusion of goods that weren't there before. Who it really affects in Smith's thinking about it, at least, is those people whose job it is back in England to do the trading and dealing in those goods, no matter what they happen to be, sugar or tobacco or cotton or what have you. So that's sort of is a key point about what Smith is saying here. Yeah, I mean, of course it's going to improve the society in which that commerce is taking place, but contingent only on that commerce staying within that country. Otherwise, it doesn't affect the economy of that country. It affects the economy of the country where the money's going into the pocket of the workers, right? When we talk about economic recovery in particular, one of the things that is sort of very frequently focused upon is the idea that one way to spur economic recovery is to put more money in the pockets of people to spend so that they can generate growth in an economy that otherwise is performing poorly. And that can be done in a number of ways. It can be done in tax cuts. It can be done in welfare distribution. It can be done in other ways. But the key point is that it's money in the pockets of people. If the workers that are getting paid for doing the work, if that money's going into the pockets of people outside your borders, then it doesn't have the positive consequence, right? Because that demand that would be created by that money doesn't apply to your economy. It applies to the economy outside your borders. Returning. This is 5 lines into the second paragraph. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest nor knows how much he is promoting it. Again, it is unconscious and a side effect rather than the primary purpose. By preferring the support of the domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end, which was no part of his intention. So all unintentional. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of. By pursuing his own interests, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. So it isn't only that this is an unintentional consequence of laissez-faire capitalism. It is, in fact, Smith's belief that that going out of your way to make a positive societal contribution has negative consequences. The statesman who should attempt to direct private people in what manner they ought to employ their capitals would not only load himself with the most unnecessary attention, but assume an authority which could safely be trusted not only to no single person, but to no council or senate whatever, and which would nowhere be so dangerous as in the hands of a man who had folly and presumption enough to fancy himself fit to exercise it. So his argument in this paragraph essentially is that because capitalism and markets allocate resources so efficiently, to have some government person try to put his hand into that and manage it more efficiently is a joke. It is folly, he says, it is delusion to think that you could. It is thus that every system which endeavors, either by extraordinary encouragements, to draw towards a particular species of industry a greater share of the capital of the society than would naturally go to it, which is to say by taxing, or by extraordinary restraints, force from a particular species of industry some share of the capital which would otherwise be employed in it, which is to say by requisition or something like that, is in reality subversive to that great purpose which it means to promote. It retards instead of accelerating the progress of the society toward real wealth and greatness, and diminishes instead of increasing the real value of the annual produce of its land and labor. Last paragraph. All systems, either of preference or of restraint, therefore being thus completely taken away, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty, ding, 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 establishes itself of its own accord. Every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, which is to say, non-aggression, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest in his own way, and to bring both industry and capital into competition with those of any other man or order of men. The sovereign is completely discharged from a duty, sovereign here being government, in the attempt to perform which he must always be exposed to innumerable delusions, and for the proper performance of which no human wisdom or knowledge can ever be sufficient. The duty of superintending the industry of private people and of directing it towards the employments most suitable to the interest of the society. So it's an argument against government intervention, and it's an argument against government redistribution. Not because he doesn't care, but because he believes that it happens anyway. It happens by virtue of just the society as a whole becoming wealthier. And again, not to put too fine a point on this, he also is writing this at a point at which industrialization was, at that point, still limited. According to the system of natural liberty, the sovereign has only 3 duties to attend to, 3 duties of great importance indeed, but plain and intelligible to common understandings. First, the duty of protecting society from violence and invasion of other independent societies, so invasion from without. Secondly, the duty of protecting as far as possible every member of the society from the injustice or oppression of every other member of it, from the good old war of all against all. And then third, the duty of erecting and maintaining, certain public works and certain public institutions which it can never, for the interest of any individual or small number of individuals, to erect and maintain, because the profit could never repay the expense to any individual or small number of individuals, though it may frequently do much more than repay to a great society. So any industry which doesn't make money. So this raises a few questions, by the way. The first thing is that, well, if you're going to leave some industry in the hands of government, how's government going to pay for that? It's going to have to tax. It's the only form of revenue that a government has. And therefore, whether it's a tax on the people, whether it's a tax on luxuries, or whether it's a tax in the form of a duty or a tariff on goods that are going in or out of the country, there's going to have to be a tax. The government doesn't make money any other way. That's point number one. So Smith concedes, although not explicitly, that taxation is part of the deal. It's just that it needs to be at a minimal level, because it's not the business of the government to work at a profit either, right? The government has certain responsibilities that it has to fulfill, and by fulfilling those duties, it incurs expenses and needs to have the cash on hand in order to pay those expenses. But anything beyond that, Smith would argue, would be excessive. Second thing about this is, well, what kinds of things is he talking about? Because we might have said 50 years ago in the United States, well, like the mail, but one of the things that we've definitively proven is that you can compete with the Postal Service, and you can arguably do better than they do, and you can make money at it. Right? Federal Express and UPS and DHL are all big companies with big profits. So what is he talking about? What are the businesses you can't make money at? Which sort of has a corollary question, which is there any business that you can't make money at? So the basic responsibilities of the government are to protect the borders, to protect the people, settle disputes and property. Right? So if you, so the second one of those, right, to protect people requires a criminal justice system, and a criminal justice system, at least as we understand it today, requires prisons. Right? Now, it was thought at the time, certainly in Smith's time, and in this country probably until about 25 years ago, that couldn't be done at a profit either. Couldn't run prisons at a profit. But it turns out you can run prisons at a profit. So, who knows anything about for-profit prisons? You know a little bit about, so what are for-profit prisons like? What is the...
Oh, I just assumed that, like, they come out of, like, people's taxes.
Well, they do, right? Because the government has to pay the private prison company. But the argument that's made by a government that contracts with the private prison company is that it would cost less than it would to administer the prisons on its own. That in some way, and let's assume for the moment that that's actually correct, okay? Say that, you know, it costs the state of Pennsylvania, and I'm making up the numbers just for the point of illustration. Say that it costs the state of Pennsylvania $2 billion a year to run its prison system. And this company says that it can run the prison system for $1 billion, and thereby cut the cost for Pennsylvania in half. But here's the thing about that offer, should Pennsylvania take it or not, is that that $1 billion and that $2 billion, it's going to be allocated to do the same work. It's going to be the same people in prison that have the same needs and everything else. So how is a company going to do for half the money what a government could only do for the full amount? Well, I've already pointed out to you how companies cut costs. So it's going to have lower paid or fewer people employed, and it's going to cut costs on things like food. It's going to cut costs on things like overall security, for that matter. It's going to cut costs, and because again, it's corporations that are doing the overall sort of managing of this, and they are designed to profit. The other point to bear in mind about this is that when you put it into private hands, then profit comes out of it. When you leave it in government hands, you take profit out of the equation, right? So it might cost the state $2 billion to run the prison system, but it's not making a profit. If it's costing this corporation $1 billion to run the prison system, it's doing it at half the price, plus it's paying people and making a profit in the process, which means that actually the actual thing that it's paying out and its cost that it has to cover is probably even less than that. In fact, it assuredly is less than that, which means that it's coming out someplace else. So what happened in Pennsylvania was that in order to keep this sustainable, because even with things like, you know, the worst quality food and, you know, a skeleton crew of poorly trained and non-unionized employees, it's still wasn't making ends meet, so they had, bribery deals with judges to make sure that they kept more prisoners in the jails. Because again, if you are a corporation, you are not in the business of being moral, you are in the business of making money. So, although it isn't necessarily Smith's argument, in fact, Smith doesn't really sort of make a moral argument about this at all. He's limited in his imagination about this by a few things, not the least of which is just that because there's no industrialization, there's no ability to realize that certain things could be made profitable that at his time were not. But there's a moral aspect of it, to it that applies as well. That at some point you are going to get into a gray area where where your ability to make profit is going to compromise your ability to do good in the greater objective moral sense of the word. Now, why privatize prisons? Because people don't care about prisoners, and so the consequences of that are going to be felt much less by the population at large, which both has a disconnected relationship with people in prison, if a relationship at all, and then second of all, has very little, if no sympathy for people that are in prisons. So if you screw those people, that's fine. With things like schools and stuff like that, it's much more difficult because now you're talking about people's children. People tend to love their children. People tend to care about them, and so they're going to be concerned if the food is substandard and stuff like that. But there's no question that when you privatize schools, you get better outcomes. The best schools in the country are private schools. They also cost $75,000 a year, whereas the school down the street is free. You can offset that in any number of ways, not the least of which is that you raise taxes. How many of you grew up in New Jersey? So you might have heard your parents talking about how high the property taxes are in New Jersey. They're very high in New Jersey. The consequences of that is that the public schools are really good. Not every jurisdiction is willing to pay out that much in terms of property taxes to make their schools good. Right? So the poorest schools in the country, or the poorest quality schools in the country, are in the poorest places. Right? The inner cities have the worst schools. The inner cities have the worst schools because the property values are lowest, and therefore the property taxes are the lowest. And on top of it, there's a very low rate of property ownership to begin with. Most of the property taxes are paid by landlords that don't live in the city, so they don't have any skin in the game. So, again, when Smith was writing, he was writing about a completely privatized school system. There wasn't publicly funded schools in the UK until the 20th century. So, not a point that he was specifically addressing here, so much as one that is a consequence of applying his kind of thinking to the world since then. So, questions about any of that? I realize that's kind of a lot, but we'll talk about it more, and we'll talk more about capitalism actually than we talk about Marx, because Marx is a very detailed critic of capitalism, as you might be aware. And the second thing is that, but also a very astute sociologist. So Marx is actually sort of better as a sociologist, as an observer of human behavior, than he is an economist, although arguably he's an important economist as well. So, but we'll extend the discussion in the next class, a week from tonight, to talk about freedom in the broader sense, and just to sort of go full circle on this point. The idea of talking about capitalism, talking about socialism in the next unit, and talking about them with regard to freedom and equality, is that capitalism is a system that is, I hope I explained tonight, is very closely associated, if at least in the public mind, if not in actual truth, with freedom, whereas equality is very highly associated with socialism, if not in outcome, at least in opportunity. And freedom and equality are in a constant tension within democracies. In a dictatorship, in an authoritarian state, what have you, it's possible for government, because it wields an extraordinary amount of force to impose things like inequality. In democracies, equalities tend to be things that are desired because of the underlying assumption within a democracy, which is everybody has equal rights. But at the same time, we like freedom too. And so, but there is a point at which the two come into conflict. And that's, and it's not just economics that it does, but economics is a key area in which it does. So, any questions about that before we turn to discussion of your quiz? So